Chapter 1. Rome at its height, before the long decline. At its greatest extent, around 117 CE, the Roman Empire stretched across nearly 2 million square miles, encompassing territory from Britain's misty northern frontier to Egypt's sun-baked southern deserts, from Spain's Atlantic coastline to the distant reaches of Mesopotamia in the east. This vast territory contained an estimated 70 million people, an extraordinary diversity of languages, cultures, and religious traditions, all bound together under Roman law, Roman administration, and the shared infrastructure of roads, aqueducts, and cities that Roman engineering had made possible across 3 continents. The famous Roman peace, known as the Pax Romana, had brought roughly 2 centuries of relative internal stability across this enormous territory, trade flowing freely along secure roads and sea lanes, cities flourishing with public buildings, and countless local populations gradually adopting Roman customs, language, and citizenship. Rome itself, the empire's symbolic and administrative heart, had grown into a metropolis of over 1 million residents, its forums, temples, and monuments representing centuries of accumulated wealth, conquest, and architectural achievement unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. The Roman military, organized into disciplined legions stationed along the empire's extensive frontiers, had secured this vast territory through centuries of conquest and, increasingly, through sophisticated diplomatic relationships with neighboring peoples along the empire's borders. Yet even at this moment of apparent strength, subtle vulnerabilities were quietly accumulating beneath the surface of Roman prosperity, vulnerabilities that would gradually, unevenly, but ultimately decisively reshape the empire over the following several centuries. The sheer scale of Roman territory had always presented genuine administrative challenges, communication between the empire's distant frontiers and its central government in Rome taking weeks or even months, making rapid, coordinated response to distant crises increasingly difficult as the empire's borders continued stretching further from its Italian heartland. Economic patterns within the empire had also begun shifting gradually, wealth increasingly concentrating among a relatively small aristocratic class, while ordinary farmers and laborers across many regions experienced growing economic pressure, a pattern that would eventually strain the empire's broader social and economic stability. Military recruitment, too, was gradually changing, the legions increasingly relying on soldiers recruited from frontier provinces and even neighboring peoples beyond Roman borders, rather than exclusively from Italian citizens, as earlier Roman military tradition had generally emphasized. These gradual shifts, largely unnoticed by ordinary Romans living comfortably within the empire's secure borders during this particular period, would eventually compound and interact with additional pressures in ways that no single Roman official or emperor could have fully anticipated or effectively prevented. By examining this period of apparent Roman strength carefully, historians gain valuable perspective on how even history's most powerful, seemingly permanent civilizations can contain within their own success the gradual, accumulating seeds of eventual, complicated transformation and decline. Chapter 2. The Crisis of the 3rd Century. Beginning around 235 CE, the Roman Empire entered a prolonged period of severe internal instability that later historians would call the Crisis of the 3rd Century, nearly 50 years during which the empire's political, military, and economic foundations faced unprecedented, sustained strain. This crisis began with escalating political instability at the very top of Roman government, emperors rising and falling with alarming frequency, many meeting violent ends through assassination or civil war as rival military commanders repeatedly seized power through force rather than orderly succession. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire saw more than 20 different emperors claim power, most ruling for only brief periods before being overthrown. this constant political turnover making sustained, coherent governance increasingly difficult across the empire's vast territory. Simultaneously, external military pressure intensified considerably along multiple frontiers, Germanic peoples pressing against the empire's northern borders with growing frequency, while a newly resurgent Persian Empire launched significant incursions against Roman territory in the east. The empire's economy suffered severely during this same period, emperors repeatedly debasing Roman currency to fund constant military campaigns, leading to significant inflation that undermined trade and economic stability throughout Roman territory. At one particularly dire moment, around 260 CE, the empire briefly fractured into three separate competing states: a breakaway empire in the west, centered in Gaul, a breakaway kingdom in the east, centered around Palmyra, and the remaining central Roman territory, still nominally controlling Italy and the traditional imperial core. This fragmentation represented perhaps the empire's closest brush with complete immediate collapse, the very real possibility that Roman unity might simply dissolve permanently into several smaller, competing successor states rather than continuing as a single unified political entity. Remarkably, a series of capable military emperors, particularly Aurelian, ruling from 270 to 275 CE, managed to reunite these fractured territories through decisive military campaigns, temporarily restoring Roman territorial unity and demonstrating the empire's continued capacity for resilience even amid severe crisis. This third-century crisis left lasting scars on Roman society and governance. However, accelerating trends toward increased military influence over political succession, growing regional autonomy, and a gradual shift away from earlier Roman civic and political traditions that had characterized the empire's earlier centuries. Chapter 3: Diocletian, Constantine, and the Division of the Empire. Following the 3rd century crisis's severe disruptions, the Emperor Diocletian, coming to power in 284 CE, implemented sweeping administrative reforms specifically designed to address the structural vulnerabilities this prolonged crisis had so clearly exposed. Diocletian recognized that the empire's sheer territorial scale made effective governance by a single ruler increasingly impractical, and so he established a system called the tetrarchy, dividing administrative authority among 4 co-rulers responsible for different regions of the vast empire. This administrative division created, for the first time in a formal sense, meaningfully separate Eastern and Western administrative structures within the broader Roman Empire, even though both regions remained officially unified under shared imperial law and tradition. Diocletian also implemented significant economic reforms, attempting to control persistent inflation through price regulations, while reorganizing tax collection and military recruitment systems to provide more reliable, sustainable funding for the empire's continued defense and administration. Following Diocletian's eventual retirement, renewed political competition among rival claimants eventually brought Constantine to power, first controlling the western portion of the empire, before eventually reuniting the entire Roman territory under his sole authority by 324 CE. Constantine's reign proved historically significant for several major reasons, including his personal conversion to Christianity, beginning a gradual but ultimately transformative shift as this once persecuted religious minority increasingly gained official imperial favor and, eventually, dominant religious status throughout Roman territory. Perhaps equally significant, Constantine established a new imperial capital at Constantinople, strategically positioned controlling crucial trade routes between Europe and Asia, a decision that would prove enormously consequential for the empire's eventual, divergent Eastern and Western historical trajectories. Following Constantine's death, the pattern of dividing administrative authority between Eastern and Western regions gradually became increasingly permanent, later emperors generally ruling either the eastern or western portions of the empire, even as both regions officially remained part of a single, theoretically unified Roman state. This growing administrative division between East and West, initially intended as practical governance solution, would eventually prove crucial in determining why the empire's western and eastern portions experienced such dramatically different historical fates during the centuries that followed. Chapter 4. Growing pressure along the frontiers. Throughout the 4th century, pressure along Rome's extensive frontiers continued intensifying. Various Germanic peoples, including the Goths, Vandals, and Franks, increasingly pressing against Roman borders, sometimes through outright military conflict, sometimes through negotiated settlement within Roman territory itself. A pivotal moment arrived in 376 CE, when large groups of Goths, themselves fleeing pressure from the fearsome Huns advancing from Central Asia, requested permission to cross the Danube River and settle within Roman territory, seeking protection from this new, formidable threat pressing against their own traditional homelands. Roman authorities initially granted this request, viewing it as an opportunity to gain additional manpower for Roman military forces, though poor treatment and administrative mismanagement of these Gothic settlers soon led to escalating tension and, eventually, open conflict. This tension culminated dramatically in 378 CE at the Battle of Adrianople, where Gothic forces decisively defeated a Roman army, killing the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens himself, a shocking military disaster that demonstrated Rome's declining ability to control and manage the increasingly complex pressures building along its frontiers. The Huns themselves, meanwhile, continued advancing westward across the following decades, their formidable cavalry-based warfare displacing numerous other peoples who, in turn, increasingly sought refuge within or near Roman territory, creating a cascading pattern of population movement historians often call the migration period. Roman military and political leadership found itself increasingly stretched thin, attempting to manage these compounding frontier pressures. Resources and attention divided between defending against direct military threats and attempting, often unsuccessfully, to peacefully integrate large groups of displaced peoples into Roman territory and society. These frontier pressures interacted increasingly with the empire's internal political and administrative challenges. Resources needed for frontier defense sometimes diverted toward internal political conflicts, while regional Roman commanders occasionally prioritized their own political ambitions over coordinated, empire-wide strategic response. By the century's final decades, it had become increasingly clear that the pressures accumulating along Rome's frontiers represented something more significant than routine, manageable border conflict. Though the full scale of the transformation these pressures would eventually produce remained, for now, still gradually unfolding, rather than immediately, dramatically obvious. Chapter 5. Alaric and the Sack of Rome. Among the various Gothic leaders navigating this complicated period of shifting alliances and mounting tension with Roman authority, a man named Alaric emerged as particularly significant, leading a substantial group of Visigoths through several decades of complex negotiation, conflict, and shifting relationship with the Western Roman government. Alaric's forces had served at times as allies within Roman military structures, while at other moments, finding themselves in direct conflict with Roman authorities, this complicated relationship reflecting the broader difficulty Roman leadership faced in consistently managing relationships with various Germanic groups now residing within or near Roman territory. Repeated negotiations between Alaric and Roman authorities, particularly regarding payment, land settlement, and formal recognition for his forces, repeatedly broke down over subsequent years, tension gradually escalating as neither side found sustainable, mutually acceptable terms for their complicated relationship. By 408 CE, negotiations had deteriorated significantly. Alaric leading his forces toward Rome itself, using the threat of military action against the city as leverage in his ongoing attempts to secure favorable terms from an increasingly unstable Western Roman government. After several years of failed negotiations and shifting political circumstances within Rome's own leadership, Alaric's forces finally entered the city itself in August 410 CE, an event that sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world, marking the first time in nearly 800 years that Rome itself had fallen to a foreign military force. While Alaric reportedly ordered his forces to show some restraint, avoiding complete destruction and generally respecting religious sanctuaries, the psychological impact of this event proved immense. Rome's symbolic invulnerability, so deeply embedded in Roman self-identity, having been dramatically, undeniably broken. News of Rome's fall spread throughout the empire and beyond, prominent thinkers of the era grappling seriously with what this event meant for Roman civilization's broader trajectory, some viewing it as divine punishment, others as clear evidence of the Western Empire's accelerating political and military decline. Alaric himself died shortly after this event, his forces eventually settling in southern Gaul and later Spain, establishing what would become a significant, semi-independent Visigothic kingdom that, while nominally connected to Roman authority, increasingly operated according to its own independent political and military priorities. This sack of Rome, though not immediately fatal to the broader Western Roman Empire's continued existence, represented a genuinely significant psychological and symbolic turning point, clear evidence that the vulnerabilities accumulating over previous decades had now produced consequences no longer possible to dismiss as merely distant, frontier concerns. Chapter 6. The Western Empire's Continued Weakening. Following Rome's dramatic sack in 410 CE, the Western Roman Empire continued experiencing accelerating political and territorial fragmentation over the following decades. Central imperial authority increasingly unable to effectively control or coordinate the empire's remaining western territories. Britain, one of the empire's more distant provinces, was formally abandoned by Roman authority around 410 CE, imperial forces withdrawing entirely as the central government found itself unable to spare resources for defending this increasingly peripheral, difficult-to-maintain territorial holding. Gaul and Spain experienced similarly accelerating fragmentation. Various Germanic peoples, including the previously mentioned Visigoths, along with Vandals, Suebi, and others, gradually establishing increasingly independent, semi-autonomous territorial control across regions nominally still considered Roman provinces. The Vandals proved particularly consequential during this period, eventually crossing from Spain into North Africa around 429 CE, successfully establishing an independent kingdom that captured Carthage, one of the Western Empire's most economically significant remaining territories, severely disrupting crucial grain supplies that Rome itself depended upon. Western imperial authority increasingly relied upon powerful military commanders, often themselves of partial Germanic heritage, to manage remaining territorial defense and administration, these commanders sometimes wielding more genuine practical power than the nominal emperors they officially served. Flavius Aetius emerged as perhaps the most significant such commander during this period, effectively managing Western Roman military and political affairs for over 2 decades, skillfully balancing complex relationships with various Germanic groups while attempting to preserve whatever remained of effective central Roman authority. Economic conditions throughout the Western Empire continued deteriorating during this period as well. Disrupted trade routes, reduced tax revenue from lost or contested territories, and the enormous ongoing cost of military campaigns, all compounding the empire's mounting fiscal and administrative difficulties. Roman citizens throughout the empire's remaining western territories increasingly experienced daily life shaped by this ongoing political fragmentation, local Roman aristocrats, sometimes negotiating directly with Germanic leaders for protection and stability, rather than relying primarily upon increasingly distant, ineffective central imperial authority. By the 440s, the Western Roman Empire retained only a fraction of its earlier territorial extent and administrative coherence, though it had not yet completely collapsed. Various regional arrangements and remaining loyal territories, still nominally maintaining connection to increasingly symbolic Western imperial authority, centered in Italy. Chapter 7. Attila and the Hunnic Threat. While various Germanic peoples had gradually established increasingly independent territorial control throughout the Western Empire's fragmenting provinces, an entirely different, formidable threat emerged from Central Asia, one that would briefly unite much of Europe in shared, urgent concern. Attila, leading a powerful confederation of Hunnic and allied forces, had gradually consolidated substantial authority throughout regions north of the Roman frontier, his formidable cavalry-based military forces representing a genuinely serious threat to both Eastern and Western Roman territories alike. Attila initially focused considerable military pressure against the Eastern Roman Empire, extracting substantial tribute payments through a combination of direct military threat and periodic actual invasion, Eastern Roman authorities generally finding it more practical to pay for peace than risk costly, uncertain military confrontation. By 451 CE, Attila turned his attention toward the Western Empire, launching a major invasion into Gaul, this dramatic threat prompting an unusual, temporary alliance between Roman forces under Aetius and various Germanic peoples, including Visigoths, who recognized Attila's advance as a threat to their own territorial interests as well. This combined Roman and Germanic force met Attila's army at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, a massive, costly engagement that, while not resulting in Attila's forces being completely destroyed, successfully halted his advance into Gaul, forcing his eventual withdrawal from Western territory. Attila attempted a subsequent invasion into Italy itself in 452 CE, causing considerable destruction and panic before eventually withdrawing, reportedly influenced partly by negotiations involving the Roman Pope, though disease and logistical difficulties affecting his own forces likely played equally significant practical roles in this withdrawal decision. Attila died suddenly in 453 CE, his death triggering rapid fragmentation of the powerful Hunnic confederation he had assembled, various subordinate peoples quickly asserting independence rather than maintaining unified loyalty to Attila's potential successors. This sudden collapse of Hunnic power removed one significant source of pressure from Roman territory, though the broader pattern of territorial fragmentation and declining central authority that had characterized recent decades continued largely unaffected by this particular threat's relatively sudden resolution. The temporary alliance between Roman forces and various Germanic peoples against Attila's invasion also demonstrated something increasingly significant about this period's complicated political reality. The traditional distinction between Roman and barbarian had become considerably more blurred and complicated than earlier, simpler historical narratives had generally suggested. Chapter 8, 476 CE, the traditional end date. Following Attila's death and the Hunnic Confederation's rapid collapse, the Western Roman Empire continued its gradual territorial and political fragmentation throughout the 450s, 460s, and into the 470s, central authority increasingly limited to Italy itself, and even there, increasingly nominal in practice. A succession of relatively powerless Western emperors occupied the imperial throne during these final decades, most wielding little genuine independent authority, their positions largely controlled by powerful Germanic military commanders who had become the empire's actual practical power brokers. Orestes, a Roman official who had previously served the Hunnic court under Attila, gained significant influence during this period, eventually placing his own young son, Romulus Augustulus, on the Western imperial throne in 475 CE, though genuine practical authority remained firmly in Orestes' own hands. This arrangement proved short-lived. A Germanic military commander named Odoacer, leading forces largely composed of various Germanic peoples serving within Roman military structures, rebelled against Orestes in 476 CE, defeating and killing him before turning his attention toward the young, largely powerless emperor. Rather than installing another puppet emperor as previous power brokers had generally done, Odoacer made a historically significant decision, deposing Romulus Augustulus entirely and sending the Western imperial regalia to Constantinople, effectively declaring that a separate Western Roman emperor was no longer necessary. This event, September 4th, 476 CE, is traditionally marked by historians as the Western Roman Empire's formal end date, though contemporaries themselves may not have immediately recognized this moment's full historical significance, given how gradually and unevenly Roman authority had already been declining for decades. Odoacer himself continued ruling Italy as a practical, independent authority, technically acknowledging the Eastern Roman Emperor's nominal overlordship while functioning, in practical terms, as Italy's genuinely independent ruler, a pattern that reflected broader realities across much of the former Western Empire. Many historians today emphasize that this traditional 476 CE end date, while useful as a clear symbolic marker, somewhat oversimplifies what had actually been a much longer, more gradual process of transformation, one lacking any single, universally agreed-upon moment representing Roman civilization's complete, sudden collapse. Roman institutions, Roman law, and Roman cultural influence continued persisting throughout former Western territories for generations following 476 CE, gradually blending with Germanic political and social structures rather than disappearing entirely in any sudden, complete historical rupture. Chapter 9. Why did Rome really fall? Historians have debated the Western Roman Empire's decline and fall for centuries, proposing numerous explanations ranging from single, decisive causes to complex combinations of interacting political, economic, military, and social factors accumulating gradually across multiple centuries. Economic factors certainly played significant roles throughout this long process. Persistent currency debasement, disrupted trade networks, and gradually declining tax revenue from contested or lost territories all compounding to undermine the empire's fiscal capacity for maintaining effective military defense and administration. Military factors proved equally significant. The empire's increasing reliance on frontier and foreign recruitment gradually changing the fundamental character of Roman military forces, while sustained pressure from numerous different peoples along multiple frontiers simultaneously stretched available resources dangerously thin. Political instability, particularly evident during the devastating 3rd century crisis, but continuing in various forms throughout subsequent centuries, repeatedly disrupted effective, coordinated governance precisely when unified, decisive leadership was most urgently needed to address mounting external and internal challenges. The empire's sheer territorial scale, once a source of tremendous strength and wealth, increasingly became a genuine administrative liability. Effective communication and coordinated response across such vast distances becoming progressively more difficult as various regional crises demanded simultaneous attention and resources. Some historians emphasize the significant demographic and social changes accompanying large-scale Germanic migration and settlement, suggesting these population movements, whatever their ultimate causes, fundamentally transformed the social and political composition of former Roman territories beyond simple recovery to previous arrangements. Religious transformation, particularly Christianity's gradual rise to dominant status, has generated considerable historical debate as well, some scholars suggesting this shift redirected resources and attention away from traditional civic institutions, though this particular causal argument remains genuinely contested among modern historians. Climate and disease factors have also received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades, evidence suggesting a period of unusual climate instability and devastating plague outbreaks during the empire's later centuries, factors that likely compounded existing political and economic vulnerabilities in ways contemporary Romans could not have fully understood or effectively addressed. Most contemporary historians now favor complex, multi-causal explanations over simple, single-factor theories, recognizing that the Western Roman Empire's decline resulted from numerous interacting pressures accumulating gradually across centuries, rather than any single decisive cause or dramatic, sudden collapse. Chapter 10. The Eastern Empire's Continued Survival. Closing chapter. While the Western Roman Empire experienced this gradual, complicated decline and eventual political fragmentation, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered around Constantinople, continued flourishing for nearly another 1,000 years, a remarkable historical continuity often overlooked in popular narratives focusing primarily on Rome's Western decline. This Eastern Empire, which modern historians often call the Byzantine Empire, though its own citizens continued considering themselves simply Roman throughout its long history, benefited from significant advantages the Western Empire had increasingly lacked during its final centuries. Constantinople's strategic location, controlling crucial trade routes between Europe and Asia, provided substantial ongoing economic advantages, while the Eastern Empire's more compact, defensible territorial core proved considerably easier to govern and defend effectively, compared to the Western Empire's more sprawling, difficult to coordinate territorial holdings. The Eastern Empire successfully weathered numerous military and political challenges throughout subsequent centuries, including its own encounters with various Germanic peoples, Persian rivals, and eventually emerging Islamic forces, maintaining remarkable political and cultural continuity despite these repeated external pressures. Emperor Justinian, ruling in the 6th century, even briefly succeeded in reconquering significant portions of the former Western Empire, including Italy and North Africa, though these reconquered territories eventually proved difficult to maintain permanently against renewed pressure from various directions. Byzantine civilization preserved and continued developing significant elements of classical Roman and Greek culture, law, and administrative practice throughout the medieval period, eventually transmitting much of this preserved classical knowledge back toward Western Europe during the Renaissance period many centuries later. The Eastern Roman Empire finally concluded its remarkable 1,000-year continuation in 1453 CE, when Ottoman forces successfully captured Constantinople, an event marking the definitive end of continuous Roman imperial tradition stretching back, in an unbroken if evolving line, over 2,000 years to the ancient Roman Republic's earliest origins. This much longer Eastern survival offers valuable historical perspective on the Western Empire's earlier decline, demonstrating that Roman civilization's fundamental collapse was never truly inevitable or universal, but rather resulted from specific historical circumstances and accumulated pressures particular to the Western Empire's own distinct historical trajectory. As this long, complicated story of Rome's gradual transformation finally settles toward its quiet close, perhaps the most valuable lesson lies not in any single dramatic ending, but in recognizing how even history's most powerful civilizations remain subject to gradual change, adaptation, and eventual transformation, their legacies persisting in complicated, evolving forms long after their original political structures have finally, gently faded into the patient, continuing flow of human history.